Hello and welcome everyone to today's session from Credo InfoLit Learning Community. We have a series of guest speakers and today I believe is our fourth session. And before we officially begin our special guest speaker, and would like to introduce to you Henrietta Verma. She's from Credo and she is here to tell us a little bit about today's session and introduce Vanessa. So go right ahead, Etta.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to everybody for joining in today. I hope it's nice and sunny wherever you are. It's a nice day in New York. So today, as Sarah said, it's the fourth in our Credo InfoLit Learning Community speaker series. And today we are featuring Vanessa Otero, who you can see there next to me. Vanessa is a patent attorney, and she's also the creator of the media bias chart that I know many of you are already familiar with. Today, Vanessa is going to discuss with us how the chart can be used to determine the level of bias in a particular source, and as well how the chart can be used in your work with students. We are going to have a little Q&A session at the end of Vanessa's presentation, so please do store up your questions for that time. And with that, it's all yours, Vanessa. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It's one of my favorite topics. And I'm just going to jump right into it because I've got a lot of information to cover and I want to make sure that I leave plenty of time for your questions. I've gotten lots of questions over the past couple of years about this chart. So hopefully as we go through the presentation, we'll cover a lot of them that you were planning on asking, but definitely want to make sure that we get to your questions at the end. So the name of my company is Ad Fontes Media, and Ad Fontes is Latin for to the source, or back to the source. And it was a kind of a battle cry during a Renaissance humanization period and also the Protestant Reformation. In both instances, leaders of those movements thought that it was very important to go back to original sources. Meaning, Greek texts or the Bible in those respective cases. And we're going to talk about today going back to the sources to really look at what is in our news. I'll keep coming back to that concept over and over throughout today. So I'm here to talk about the media bias chart. And I know quite a few of you have probably seen this on the internet. That might be why you are logging on today. And while I go over this, I just want to throw out a quick poll question to see how many of you have actually used this as a resource, have seen it before, or planning on using this as a resource. Go ahead and answer yes or no. Oh, thanks. You guys are great with your quick responses. I appreciate that. All right. So looks like more than half so far have seen it, maybe 60-40 or so. I have the chart pulled up in a couple of my slides, but if you want to refer to it, if you are, especially if you're not familiar with it, if you just pull up another window so you can have it for reference, it's just go to mediabiaschart.com. That redirects to my blog called allgeneralizationsarefalse.com, and you should be able to see right near the top there a JPEG of it and blow that up. So I'm going to go over specific aspects of it throughout this this webinar today, but just in general, it's a chart that graphs, it plots media sources, so about 80 of some of the more popular ones that people rely on for their news on a two-dimensional spectrum of quality and political bias. So I wanted to go through what this chart has really become, because at first glance it's a picture of the media landscape, and people may agree and disagree with various placements of it, but generally it tends to resonate with ideas people have about our news, especially people who are quite media literate, like librarians. So what it has become more in the last year and a half has become apparent to me through the feedback that I've gotten. One, it's really a new taxonomy for discussing the media landscape. That's what people have found it to be helpful for. Two, it reflects a methodology for rating quality and bias through content analysis. And what I mean by content analysis is looking directly at the words, the sentences, the pictures, and analyzing them. So I'll go through each of those topics in depth today. And it's also become a model for teaching media literacy in a new information environment. So let's just jump right into it. We'll go over my background and the background of the chart today. We'll talk about that taxonomy, and in particular, why framing the discussion visually and in 2 dimensions for both quality and bias is really helpful. Oh, before I go too much farther, I just wanted to mention that you can participate in the learning community discussion area after this, in addition to the questions and answers. So, all right. So back to so the 2 dimensions, quality and bias. We'll talk about defining the categories, what really makes up that horizontal and that vertical taxonomy. Then we'll go through the methodology, how I came up with these rankings for actually putting these sources on the places on the chart where they landed. So the methodology is content analysis driven rather than consumer perception driven. And what I mean by that, consumer perception, is that a lot of the ways that people currently rate the news are by opinion polls and by surveys, asking them who they trust, and also measuring engagement, meaning clicks and views. And that's not what we're doing here. We're analyzing the content itself. And the methodology is on a story-by-story basis, meaning that for each source, it's really a composite average of the individual news articles and the individual shows, and for each of those, rating each of the elements of those, meaning, like I said, the headlines, the graphics, the leads, and the sentences themselves. You can derive a lot of information from that, and that's what really informs the methodology here. This methodology is still under development and study. I've been at this about 1.5 years, and I find that the more that I look at the methodology, the more things we can extract from the text. And so I have a limited data set right now, because right now it's just me. I came up with this chart, and I came up with the metrics for rating. And with more data and more inputs, I hope to improve it, and with input of others as well. And as a model for teaching media literacy, how to use a chart to accommodate different levels of media literacy from very basic to very advanced. That's key, because that's one of the big challenges that I know many of you face. And then we'll get into questions. All right, so a little bit about my background. I am a patent attorney from Colorado, and that may strike you as strange because I am not a journalist. So why did I make a chart about media bias? Why do people listen to my opinion about it? And why should you? Why should you believe what I have to say? And I'll start with saying that you shouldn't. You shouldn't accept, and no one should just accept one person's word for something, or one person's opinion about something. I'm not saying that's what this is. We should trust and accept things when we have good reason to, and when it can be verified by other metrics that we can look at, not just the one. So I'll give you a couple of reasons why perhaps you could choose to value my opinion, and but mostly this is a critical thinking exercise, the very chart itself. So reasons why I think this has resonated with quite a lot of people is because my own background and training has been primarily in analytical reading and writing skills. I went to UCLA and was an English major as an undergrad, and all analytical, not no creative writing kind of skills. And then I went to law school at the University of Denver, and that was another 3 years of training just on reading and writing and thinking. And I've been a lawyer for about 4 years now. So my particular field of being a patent attorney I actually help inventors get their patents through the patent office. So they actually write up the patent applications themselves. So these are really long technical documents where we have to explain complex ideas in words and pictures. And I think that's where I got the idea to explain this concept, this subject that I was very passionate about, which is politics and media, in a visual way, because lots of people are visual. I have had a small, infrequent blog about politics and media just because I'm interested in that stuff. But it ultimately just created this chart just to facilitate a discussion with friends. I noticed in the past couple of years on social media that people would share various news sources that I found to be not credible and highly biased, and they would rely on these sources and say, oh wow, this is a really great article, and then somebody who disagreed with them would say, no, that's a terrible article and that's a terrible news source. And these are people with high levels of intelligence, and it really became alarming to me that so many people would rely on things that you as librarians with strong information literacy would just kind of be appalled at. So I created this to facilitate discussion, and then all of a sudden it got very popular. Just millions of shares on social media, various sites, and lots of people have come to know it and rely on it, agree with it, disagree with it, etc. But it really just generated a discussion. And what was surprising to me is that I got thousands of inquiries from the education sector, and especially from librarians. I did not know that I would be giving a webinar today. A couple of years ago, I did not anticipate that I would be giving a webinar to mostly librarians about this media bias chart. But I found that it's been helpful, and the feedback that I've gotten from a lot of you is that it's helpful to convey a lot of information in an environment where you often don't have much time to convey it. And you can either use it as just a baseline, or you can use it as a basis for an entire lesson. So I think that's helpful. All right. So I submit that our current media landscape is new, so the field of analyzing this media landscape is also new. There are not a lot of experts in analyzing this media landscape, not a lot of content analysis experts. And not that there aren't any, there certainly are some, but it's not as established of a field just because the proliferation of hundreds of thousands, and if not millions, of news source websites is a relatively new phenomenon because of social media and the internet. And we're facing new challenges. And I think it's going to take concerted efforts from people from a variety of fields to address the societal problems that have been caused by our new media landscape. I'm a big fan of the author Steven Pinker, in particular a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he talks about, it's about how violence has declined over history. And one of the concepts in there is that after any kind of information explosion or leap forward in technology, whether it be new trade routes or the printing press, the world has come together with the spread of more information and become closer and more peaceful. And we've recently experienced this new information explosion with the internet, and especially with social media. So it appears just because fake news has become a problem, media literacy has become a challenge, a new challenge to teach. It appears that we have momentarily, as a society, increased our ability to, and our access to information, and it now exceeds people's ability to absorb it and interpret it in helpful ways. However, I'm really optimistic that we can solve these challenges and that future generations will be very well equipped to deal with these. But I do think it will take people from all sectors, educators in particular, technologists, though, and other journalists, certainly, people who pay for journalism, everyday citizens, and people from other fields, people like patent attorneys, for example. I think there is a great need, because of the proliferation of so many news sources, for easy to understand nutrition labels of sorts of media content for media consumers. Now, I love reading as many news sources as possible and analyzing them in great detail, and I think a lot of you do probably as well, but not everybody does. Not everybody is good at it, and not everybody has the time to commit to it. So if we can figure out ways to tell folks in a reliable manner, hey, this is what's in what you're reading, I think that is a huge service, and this chart is just a beginning indicator of how to do that. All right, so let's talk about the taxonomy. Why framing the discussion in two visual dimensions is helpful. So quality and political bias are, I believe, distinct measures. If you have the chart in front of you, or can glance at it, just on your webpage real quick, you'll see that it's sort of a bell-shaped curve of news sources, and some people have a problem with that because it tends to imply that there's an equal distribution of sources across the spectrum, and I'm not necessarily asserting that. I just wanted to make sure that I included sources that were in each category, and there is some correlation. There are some overlap between quality measures and bias measures, which contributes in part to the bell-shaped curve. Another reason for that is, actually, I keep looking to the right here because I've got my chart posted on my wall. The spacing of the chart is not exactly even, and so future versions it will be even, and it's actually less bell-shaped distribution. But those two things are distinct measures, and the more we can separate them out, I think the more accurate and more helpful that is. All right. Current models for discussing these measures tend to be one-dimensional, and here's what I mean by that. There are fact checkers that exist. That's one of the primary things people rely on to make sure that the news is reliable. So Snopes, PolitiFact, Washington Post has a fact-checking section. Those verify the truth and falseness of various claims on scales of usually like 1 to 5. Usually it's not just this is absolutely true or this is absolutely false, because some things fall in the middle. But there's a limit to what can be fact-checked, and usually it's things that just seem the most outlandish. And that certainly is important and very helpful. However, there are reasons other than just the facts that sources can be of low quality or high quality, or indicate how biased they are. So most stories, most of the news that people consume is mostly based in fact, even though it won't have like glaring, outright fake news, what people call it, or lies. Most of them are based in fact, but can still be distorted and can still be unhelpful. So the universe of fact-checking is limited. Also, another thing that people pointed out is some people accuse fact-checkers of being biased themselves, and it's just because of the sample size that they're fact-checking. It's only a small percentage. So, for example, if you have two candidates that are running for a position, for example, and one of them tends to tell more lies than the other, those particular instances are going to be fact-checked more often, and the very occurrence of those being fact-checked more often gives a perception of bias. So that's helpful in some ways. Bias rating sites and polls. There are a couple of other sites out there that do this. So there's one called MediaBiasFactCheck.com that rates the sites on a left-right scale. There's one called AllSides.com where you can actually rate your own political bias, and then rate the bias of other news sources. There are several sources that will try to pull up left, right, and center versions of various different articles. Again, this is also very helpful. There are also polls, like Pew Research conducts a number of polls, Quinnipiac and Gallup, all these other polling organizations ask people what they think about the news. And that's helpful to a certain extent. But as we have seen over the last couple of years in social media, not everybody is really good at telling what they should be able to actually trust. So a lot of the poll questions have to do with how much do you trust this source? And it tends to be really highly aligned with how, with a person's political affiliation. So for example, people who are very conservative tend to have a high level of trust in Fox News, whereas people who are very liberal have almost no trust in Fox News. So what's the actual truth? How much should someone rely, objectively or as unbiasedly as possible on Fox News when you have these two starkly opposite poll reactions? So I think there's more that we can learn. Two visual dimensions is helpful because all generalizations are false. Now this is the title of, it was the original title of my blog. And if you look at that, the statement, all generalizations are false, is itself a generalization. Which means that if all generalizations are false, then some generalizations are true. And this one is false. So generalizations are a linguistic construct. We use them to summarize ideas. And the more general they are, the less true they tend to be. So when we're talking about news, this is how this plays out. When you have a generalization, somebody says, CNN is the worst. Is that true or is it false? It's an opinion statement, largely because it's unverifiable. You may think that in good faith, that may be your opinion. You may have the opposite opinion, but whatever your opinion is based on is just a universe of experiences and data points in your own head, and it's very hard to prove. So this kind of statement is the most general. It's the least true because it's the least provable, but it's very easy to communicate. So that's generally how people talk about the news and news sources, especially on social media. The more specific you can get about a particular news story, news event, show, instance, sentence, the more agreement that you can come to, even with somebody that you don't agree with politically. So if we got very granular on a thing that CNN did, then that'd be more accurate. For example, on June 8, 2012, CNN aired when it initially reported that the Supreme Court struck down the individual mandate of the Affordable Care Act. In fact, the court upheld the mandate, and CNN rushed to read the opinion and reported it wrong. So that is a thing that happened, and that is more specific. It's very specific. It's more true. But it's hard to communicate that on a large scale when you're talking about all of the news stories of CNN, everything that they've ever done, and how good they are just generally. So when we're having a discussion about that, I created kind of a middle ground in the chart. This two-dimensional taxonomy is helpful because we can say, well, CNN is generally here, and then our discussion can move forward from that point. So this is a balance between general and specific. It contains some nuance, but of course not all. This is not as granular as one particular article, but it is at least two dimensions. And you can say, no, I think CNN is a little bit better because of this reason, or I think you should move CNN a little bit to the left because of this reason. And we've had great discussions on this on my site. I've written a blog post about it, about CNN in particular, called Everyone Has an Opinion on CNN, because everybody kind of has experience watching it. So go ahead and read that when you have a chance if you're interested. So the taxonomy, I wanted to keep it simple but add as much detail as reasonably possible. So let's talk about the vertical categories. So the vertical categories are quality, and on the side it says overall quality. Here, I'll pull that up. All right. Sorry, that's a little hard to see, but on the actual chart you see it better. So the vertical arrow says overall quality, which means higher is good and lower is bad generally, but that really encompasses a ton of ideas. So let's just look at the top 4 categories, and I'll talk about why I put them like that. So at the top I put original fact reporting, which I'm categorizing as journalism, beat reporting, getting new facts, finding them out firsthand from primary sources. And then below that, fact reporting, so either the re-reporting of the original fact reporting or the confirmation of it, or the summary of it. And then below that, I put complex analysis. Complex analysis meaning fact reporting plus well-supported conclusions that really give context and detail about what those facts mean. And then right below that, analysis, meaning still well-supported conclusions, but maybe not as in-depth, maybe shorter articles that are a little bit easier to consume. If you actually looked at the sources that are ranked under complex analysis, you'll find some really good ones that people love to read and that I love to read. The Guardian, The Economist, Time Magazine, a lot of the articles in the analysis sections, Washington Post and the New York Times will fall in there. And a lot of people think that those could be considered the best sources because they have the nicest prose, the best writing, and they really give meaning and context to how we interpret the new information. And I do agree with that. And in my original version of the chart, I actually had complex analysis ranked at the very top of the chart, and then original fact reporting ranked in below that. I'm not saying that one is necessarily better than the other, but I ultimately had to make a call as to which one is the most good and the most important on these 2 dimensions. And so I settled with original fact reporting for a couple of reasons. And one of them is because the work that journalists do is hard, and the kind of awards, the awards that are awarded in journalism are for original fact reporting. The Pulitzer Prize, for example. These are stories that are hard to get because they're things that are being kept secret by bad actors or by the government or by companies, and they're hard to find. They require calling and knocking on doors and interviews and verification and re-verification and lots of editing before publishing. So those are well deserving of the awards, and this I think something that we need to value in society. Also, nothing else below it would exist without the original fact reporting. So you have some really great sources, even newer ones that could have popped up in the last few years that are internet-only sites, and they are excellent complex analysis news sites. But it's easier to hire a team of a few dozen writers and put up a website that's high quality. It's much harder to have an organization of hundreds of journalists all around the world gathering the actual news. So that's why I ended up putting it up top. So anything that's in that original fact reporting to analysis, I put squares, green and yellow squares around those, and I consider those both good sources of news. Below that, you've got opinion. And there is definitely room for opinion, room for people advocating particular political positions and advocacy of causes in general. And there's nothing wrong with that, and we certainly need a place for that in the news. But there are ways to do it that are fair and unfair. So I put just below analysis, opinion, which I'll distinguish them by saying analysis is our conclusions that are very well supported and tied to facts, and opinions are more conclusory and less tied to the facts, less verifiable because of their opinion nature. But they're ones that are still fair and use fair persuasion principles. Below that, it says selective or incomplete story, and this is where we start to get into the low quality stuff. Also, unfair persuasion. Examples of unfair persuasion include, for example, mean characterizations, adjectives that describe people in unflattering ways, unflattering pictures of political figures, for example. Selective and incomplete stories tend to leave out one of the sides, the inclusion of which would make the story more complete and give it more balance. So if you're trying to convince somebody of your opinion, but you're leaving out all the other side's actual best arguments, that drops it down into the selective or incomplete territory. And then below that, you have propaganda and contains misleading info. So stuff that's largely opinion driven, opinion stated, and the truth of it is kind of iffy. We'll get into that more when we talk about the methodology, but stuff that's intentionally misleading falls into this propaganda and contains misleading info category. Below that is just outright contains inaccurate and fabricated info. This is where you'd put the fake news, but I kind of hate the term fake news because it's overused. It's been thrown around so much that it has kind of lost its meaning. That's a thing that happens when a term is used too much, I think. So I really don't talk about fake news much at all in my blog, and I don't mention it on this chart. But inaccurate and fabricated info, that's just a total breach of journalistic ethics, and inclusion of it is, brings it all the way down the quality scale for a good reason. I think most people agree with that. Now, this doesn't necessarily account for mistakes because all journalism organizations make mistakes, including very, very good ones. And usually the ones that make mistakes, the good ones, they get hammered for it and they apologize. So that's a big distinction between sources that are in this contain inaccurate and fabricated info column. It's that they regularly, or even more often than is permissible, publish inaccurate information and don't retract it. They don't apologize for it later. Being in this category doesn't require that 90% of the things that they say are false. Even if 10% of a site's news stories contain inaccurate or fabricated info, that's already horrible. So, the batting average here, the accuracy average has to be close to 100% here. In order for people to get out of those lower columns, they need to have A's on a grading scale. All right, so taxonomy for the horizontal categories. This is something that draws out more passion in people. People get very heated discussions about political positions, but we have to define some boundaries and some reasons for what makes a source politically biased. So the horizontal categories go from most extreme liberal and conservative on the outer portions to hyper-partisan, just a little bit in, and then skews liberal and skews conservative, and then neutral in the middle. So a lot of folks take issue with the term neutral, thinking that I mean completely unbiased. And I don't mean completely unbiased because I don't think that no one is unbiased. Everyone is a human. I am a human. I am biased. So what we're referring to when we talk about neutral is minimal partisan bias or a balance of biases. So let's talk about minimal bias. A political position. The other reason why neutral is kind of a tough category is because not all political positions have an exact center. Usually, the most neutral position will still fall to the left or the right of whatever a center would be. So, by minimal partisan bias, I mean appropriate bias. A journalist actively trying to control for their bias, which you can do a lot by just intending to try to control your bias. Balance of biases, for example, is one of the reasons why CNN is where it is, because a lot of folks think it should be farther left, But say CNN does from time to time often have panelists discussing a political topic, and have somebody that's very, very liberal and somebody who's very, very conservative. Sometimes those commentators will be even out of what's considered the mainstream. And both of those are extreme, but they're still getting exposure and and ears for their audience. So it's more of a balance than actually being neutral. All right. So the scope here is the U.S. political environment, and it's on a left to right continuum. So let's talk about those two things. The U.S. political environment. This chart has to have some limits. It's a two-dimensional image. So folks have asked me folks have asked me about doing Canadian versions or European versions or all other country versions, and it's based on the U.S. because I live in the United States and I have political knowledge of of what internal politics looks like here, and that's really important in determining what bias exists. So, for example, one way that I'll get to that thought in just a second, but this is limited to the U.S. political environment. I'll leave it at that. And it's on the left-right continuum, and some people have an issue with that, given that some people's political beliefs don't fall on a strictly left-right continuum. For example, libertarians typically object because they feel their views are not represented on a strict left-right continuum. However, our two-party system ends up resulting in binary choices, such as Republican or Democrat, or this bill becomes a law or does not. And most people, even people who are not very politically astute, recognize that there is a left-right continuum in our U.S. politics. So these categories account for two different kinds of bias in an actual article. The first one is political position bias. So if you think about political positions like the environment or energy or gun control or education or the economy, immigration, all of those things, those have various political positions that are associated with extreme hyperpartisan skews, etc. So what I did was categorize certain political positions I have a table of various different political positions and what constitutes the most extreme on each side and the hyperpartisan. And as proxies, I used a couple of measures. For the most extreme liberal and most extreme conservative columns, the proxies are views that are held by some citizens, but which are really not widely held by any elected officials, or it's really very politically dangerous for an elected official to hold those positions. So that's anything outside of what our elected officials would be willing to endorse or say. I know there are some extreme ones, but most extreme liberals on the outside of those elected officials. All right. Hyperpartisan, conservative, and liberal would the proxies for those would be the positions of the most extreme elected officials. They're still in office despite having holding these positions because enough people are behind them to have them be elected. Then when you move into skews liberal and skews conservative, the proxies for those are more like the political positions as represented in the Democratic and Republican Party platforms. So a little bit broader, more big tent, but still definitely leaning one way or the other. And then the neutral is just what's in between that. All right, so there's another measure, though, that indicates whether a source is biased, an article is biased left or right, and that's linguistics. So how something's categorized, with the adjectives that are used, the extremism that's used. So to give an example, climate change itself is not necessarily the most polarizing topic as compared to some other ones, but the position that climate change is caused by humans and is is dangerous and creating bad consequences just in this country is a skews liberal to neutral political position. But if you describe the issue of climate change in a way that's extreme and fear-mongering and calling the other side names, for example, then that would push that particular article about climate change, even though it would just naturally skews liberal to neutral, it would move it over to the hyper-partisan, move it over towards hyper-partisan, for example. All right, so political bias is necessarily a moving target because political positions change over time within our society. For example, just 10 years ago in 2008, before the election of President Obama, the position of same-sex marriage being legal in the entire country would be considered probably a hyper-partisan liberal position. Today it's the law of the land, though, so arguably it's moved to or between neutral and skews liberal. So those things adjust. Other things get more extreme. So folks talk about moving goalposts all the time, and that's true. The goalposts do move. So this is something the goalposts for the chart need to be updated, I'd say about every 6 months, which I'm attempting to do. So what's nice about the horizontal taxonomy is that people can agree on the relativity of the sources, even if they disagree with each other politically, if they disagree with you politically. For example, I've had people give me feedback that say, this chart was obviously created by somebody very liberal and the whole chart should be moved over one column to the left. I've also had the opposite feedback saying that this chart is very conservative and all of the things that are in the neutral column are actually quite conservative. So there's that. But usually what the result is people say, okay, well, I'll just accept that as a premise. Like, say everything should be moved over one to the left. Do we still, if you think that that's now true, do the relative sources still fall correctly in relation to each other? Like, most people can agree that MSNBC is more liberal than CNN, which is more liberal than Fox News. And same thing with all the other relative placements of the sources. They quibble here and there on some of those higher up sources, but generally there's a lot of agreement as to relativity. So don't get too hung up with people if you are having a nice healthy debate about this. It can still stay very healthy and very civil if you just accept their premise that they think the chart should be moved one way or the other. All right. So the methodology here is content analysis driven rather than consumer perception driven, and I think that's really, really important. It is possible to grade media content according to a standardized rubric, just like it's possible to grade academic content, like AP exams you're familiar with, graded on a scale of 1 to 5 by multiple different people, and it's all written content. Bar exams, same thing. The written portions are graded on scales of 1 to 6. So we can do this, but if you've ever seen a room full of AP graders or a room full of bar graders, this is hard to do, and it takes a lot of manpower. And no one has figured out how to grade those AP tests or those bar exams with a computer, those written portions. So the same challenges exist in grading media. I think that driving things by consumer perception is difficult. It has created a lot of problems because you can measure things like clicks, views, engagement, how long somebody's been watching a video, and that information is easily gathered by computer, it's easily gathered by Facebook and Google, and it's used to sell ads, and as a result, we've gotten some really clickbaity, terrible content. So we should do it this way, is what I'm saying. It's really time consuming though. So the overall source ranking is mostly a weighted average of rankings of individual sources. I'm going to start moving faster because time is kind of flying by here. The more popular programs and stories are weighted heavier in the averages, so like the top 5 most popular stories of the day, ones that are above the fold, ones that are most shared and the highest rated. And then other factors weight certain news outlets upwards, such as the number of journalists and the time in existence, but not necessarily their viewership. So a scatter graph of, say, CNN, for example, would look like this, where, and now it's a little small and hard to see, but each of those black dots would represent individual stories and where they would be rated individually along this chart. And then the weighted average would be the ultimate place of CNN. So a measure of not only where the stories fall, but how, which ones are the most popular. There are certain evening shows on the major news networks that are like highly opinion driven, for example, that if those are highly opinion driven and highly rated, that's really going to drive the overall rating of that source into the opinion columns. All right, so content analysis, the more closely we look, the more accurately we can rank it. So the vertical rankings are based on rating each of the following elements, including the headline, the graphics, unflattering pictures of a political figure that are unnecessary, for example, the lead or the chyron. So the lead would be just the subtitle, the chyron would be like the, right here underneath the anchor's head. It's something that says, breaking news, debate at 1 p.m., or however the news is categorized, that would be rated as well. And then rating each sentence of a story on each of the following scales, which would be veracity. So this is like the PolitiFact kind of scale, like mostly completely true to completely false. That's one thing to measure, but another thing to measure is the expression. So you can have something expressed as a complete fact statement or a complete opinion statement. So 1 would be fact, 2 would be fact with some color and analysis, 3 would be a well-supported conclusion with analysis, 4 would be opinion analysis, and 5 would be an opinion statement. And then, so if you go back there, a statement that was ranked number 5 is completely false, but which is stated as a fact would be really bad, right? So that would push a ranking really low. Other thing that is kind of a judgment call is fairness or unfairness. Certain things can be fair or unfair, like untimeliness or irrelevance to a particular story, even if they are true and completely factual. So ranking in this manner is time-consuming, but performing this exercise trains the reader to spot the most important quality indicators quickly, and quick rankings are possible. So that's what I'm doing. The horizontal measures are based on initial placement of left, right, or neutral for the story topic selection itself. And then 3 measurements of bias as measured against the definitions of the columns that I mentioned before. So, for example, I would go through the articles and count the number and degree of bias of characterizations of political actors. It's really different to say somebody is unconventional versus unhinged. So you want to count the degree of bias of those. The number and degree of bias of partisan words, words like estate tax versus death tax, for example. And then the number and degree of partisan topics, the political topics that we mentioned before. A tricky part, and one reason machines are still unable to do this kind of in-depth content analysis, is accounting for any omission of facts that create bias by reading other sources you have to do that by reading sources laterally. I gotta speed up here because we're running out of time, but this part is really quick. As a model for teaching media literacy, we can do this for beginners, intermediate, and advanced, but it's necessary to adjust this because the primary skill sets necessary for evaluation of media sources are analytical reading and writing. And if you have somebody who's very young who doesn't have those skills developed, or somebody who's older who doesn't have those skills developed, it's hard for them to tell when other reading and writing is not high quality. Same thing with politics. Political knowledge, if somebody, a 7th grader has very little political knowledge. Some adults have very little political knowledge. And if you don't know what the underlying issue is, then it's really difficult to tell when something is biased. You can see that if you try to read a source. For example, if you try to read something from Al Jazeera about a story in the Middle East that you know absolutely nothing about, you know nothing about the politics, you cannot tell whether that is biased for that country. So it's the same thing for a politically unsophisticated person to read an article here in the U.S. about immigration. It's important to convey that this is about the critical thinking skill. It's not about presenting this chart as the truth. The generation coming up through school right now is naturally skeptical because they've grown up in this information environment where they don't know what to trust, and as a result, some people approach things thinking, "I'm not going to trust anything," and that's a fair reaction. But we have to teach how people can trust things. So presenting this as not the truth, but a critical thinking tool is critical. You can use a chart with beginners as a baseline to just give them some kind of orientation and then help them determine on their own. And let's see. So we'll use a chart as a baseline, and for those learners, and focus on the easiest to distinguish quality indicators. It's really hard to tell subtle bias in those top quality sources. It's much easier to tell certain quality indicators, like, for example, matching of the headline and the story. If they match, great. If they don't, that's a problem. Fact statements versus opinion statements. You can take an article that's 19 sentences and count the number of fact statements and opinion statements in that. That's appropriate for most reading levels. And then you can say, okay, 30% of these are opinion statements. Goes down in the opinion columns. And hyperbole. That's another easy to distinguish one for quality and bias. It's also helpful to compare and contrast stories that are far apart on the chart. So something from the hyper-partisan liberal column, hyper-partisan conservative column really gives a good sense in a quick manner. For intermediate and advanced, you can use a blank version. These are available on my site. Intermediate learners, you could have them read 5 to 10 articles from sources all over the chart and rank them relative to each other. I have a blog post on where I did exactly this about the Nunes memo that came out a couple of weeks ago, and just reading laterally across the chart and having students place each article on the chart relative to each other really is illuminating. But pick a political topic that's relatively well understood. That is key. For advanced students, you can actually go into quality bias ranking methodologies, and I have posts more in detail on that on my blog as well. And then you can have individual learners rate any individual article based on that methodology. So in the future, I plan on having a dynamic interactive web version of the chart that is searchable, because you can only put so many sources on there without overlapping right now. They'll be selectable, so you can see just the ones that you want to see and download a JPEG of the ones that you selected, and accessible. So right now it's not ADA compliant. I apologize. Once it's up on the for a website that's interactive, it will be visually accessible with alt text, and so people who have other visual impairments, color blindness, can see it as well. And then drill down capability for each source, where you can actually click on the source, see the scatter graph of the data points, and then have like downloadable customized versions. So say, for example, one of your friends posts a less than reputable source on Facebook and you want to discuss it with them, you can go over to the site, you can make sure that source is on there and make sure that's highlighted, download a little JPEG, maybe reply in the comments, and then continue your civilized discussion with a new basis for proceeding. Then, visualizations of traffic and influence of sources. So I'm getting some good feedback on this in the comments here, and I'll have a database of articles ranked over time, and enhance accuracy based on a large volume of ranked articles is the eventual idea. Viewable statistics on each of those, and it can be a resource for future media studies, academic studies, etc. So I do have a quick poll question, if we could put up on there to see which ones you'd like. Sorry, can we go to the last poll question, Sarah? Yeah, would you guys use any of the following tools as references? Like, would any of these be helpful to you? So you can check all that apply. A continuously updated online version of the chart with more sources, a database of past rated articles to use to calculate the ranking of sources, summaries of reasons for article ratings, lesson plans for using the chart to teach media literacy, and ability to request ratings of individual articles being relied on by students for research. So that one, if a student has a research paper, they have an article that they want to cite, it's not rated, could they submit it to us and we could say, here's basically your nutrition label telling you what's in that. So cool, thank you guys for replying to those. I'm sorry that I've taken up almost all the time, and we need to leave some time for questions. I'll take as many as I can right now, and then my contact information is here. Please email me, comment on my blog, mediabiaschart@gmail.com.
Sure. I mean, we don't have much time left, so I just wanted to remind.
All right. Anybody, do you want to pick out some questions?
Log into our information literacy community and post your questions there. You're already a member of the community by registering for this webinar today, so you can just go in there and click on discussions. But quickly, let me just try one of them that I think should be quick. Those future refinements and changes that you mentioned to the chart, when should those be available?
So I'm planning on launching the next version of the first set of tools within about 3 to 4 months. There's a lot of work in the background. I saw some questions about people, how they can help crowdsource, and we'll eventually be relying on others to help me rate. So I'll sign up for my email list, and I'll definitely be leaning on this community. I am still a full-time patent attorney, so it's not moving along as fast as I'd like, but I'm very passionate about this and really want to make this happen. So yes, sign up for my list. I'll keep you guys posted, and I've gotten a ton of really helpful feedback from people like those that are on this webinar. So shoot me your ideas, and I'll do my best to incorporate as much as possible.
And thank you for a very informative discussion. It was really helpful.